The winter of 1947 hit the mountains of West Virginia harder than anyone could remember. Snow piled 3 feet high against the wooden cabins scattered across the ridge, and the wind howled through the valleys like a wounded animal searching for shelter. Margaret Hayes stood at the window of her small cabin, watching the last rays of November sunlight disappear behind the pine trees. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to stop the cold air seeping through the gaps in the cabin walls. Her husband Thomas had been gone for 8 months now. The mine collapse took him along with 17 other men, leaving behind widows and fatherless children across 3 counties. Margaret was 42 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was completely alone. No children had blessed their marriage, and Thomas's family had moved to Ohio years ago. The mining company paid her $75 as settlement, money that vanished quickly on food, firewood, and the endless small repairs the cabin demanded. She pressed her palm against the wall near the window. Cold air rushed through a crack she could fit 2 fingers into. There were dozens of such gaps throughout the cabin where the logs had shrunk and separated over the years. Thomas always said he would fix them properly come spring, but spring never came for him. Now Margaret faced her first winter alone in a cabin that leaked cold like a sieve leaked water. The next morning, she walked the 2 miles into town, her boots crunching through the frozen snow. Beckford was barely a town at all, just a general store, a church, a post office, and a handful of houses clustered around the crossroads. She pushed open the door to Morrison's general store, and the little bell above jangled. Walter Morrison looked up from behind the counter. He was a heavy man with a thick mustache and eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. 3 other customers browsed the shelves, women from the nicer houses down by the main road. "I need supplies to seal the gaps in my cabin walls," Margaret said quietly. "The wind is coming straight through." Morrison scratched his chin. "That will cost you. Oakum, tar, proper caulking, it all adds up." "You got money, Mrs. Hayes?" Margaret opened her small purse and counted out the coins slowly. "I have $3.40. Morrison laughed, a short bark that made the other women turn and stare. "Lady, that won't even buy you enough tar to seal a doghouse. You need at least $12 for materials to do a cabin right." Heat rose to Margaret's cheeks. "I can pay more next month." The county sent a letter saying there might be additional compensation. Morrison shook his head. "I don't run a charity. Cash only. Maybe you should think about moving in with some relatives. Selling that old cabin while you still can." One of the women near the fabric section whispered something to her companion, and they both glanced at Margaret with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Margaret felt their stares like needles against her skin. She closed her purse carefully, nodded once to Morrison, and walked out without another word. The cold bit her face as she stood on the wooden sidewalk. She had nowhere to go, no relatives to take her in, and winter was just beginning. For a moment, despair threatened to pull her down like quicksand. Then she remembered something her grandmother had told her long ago, back in the Tennessee hills where she grew up. Margaret walked past the last houses of Beckford and turned onto a narrow trail that led into the woods. The forest was quiet except for the crunch of her footsteps and the occasional call of a crow. She knew these woods well. Thomas used to bring her here in autumn to gather nuts and berries. Now she was looking for something else. She found what she needed growing thick on the north side of the old oak trees, clinging to fallen logs, and carpeting the shaded ground beneath the pines. Moss. Rich, green, living moss that her grandmother had used for everything from packing wounds to filling gaps in cabin walls. It held moisture, it expanded when wet, it packed tight, and it insulated better than almost anything else nature provided. Margaret knelt in the snow and began carefully harvesting the moss, working it free from the bark with her cold fingers. She filled her canvas sack until it bulged heavy on her shoulder. On her way back through town, she stopped at Morrison's store one more time. Morrison looked up with surprise when she entered. "Change your mind about those relatives?" Margaret set 3 pennies on the counter. "I would like to purchase this bag of moss I collected. 3 cents seems fair for a bundle this size." Morrison stared at her like she had lost her mind. "You want to buy moss?" "Lady, moss grows free everywhere." "I know," Margaret said calmly. But I want to do this properly. 3 cents for the bundle. Will you sell it to me or not? Morrison shrugged and swept the coins into his hand. Your money, your foolishness. Margaret picked up her bundle and walked out, her head held high. Margaret spent the next 3 days working on her cabin. She stuffed the moss into every crack and gap she could find, packing it tight with a wooden spoon handle. The work was slow and her fingers grew raw from the cold, but she refused to stop. The moss expanded slightly as it absorbed moisture from the air, creating a dense seal that blocked the wind far better than she had hoped. By the 4th day, word had spread through Beckford. Margaret Hayes, the widow woman, was sealing her cabin with moss like some kind of mountain primitive. She heard the whispers at the post office when she went to check for mail. She saw the looks when she passed women on the street. On Sunday, she walked to church as she always did. The small white building sat on a hill overlooking the valley, and Margaret had attended services there for 15 years. She took her usual seat in the 3rd pew from the back, folding her hands in her lap. Clara Pemberton slid into the pew beside her. Clara was the wife of the mine superintendent, a woman who wore store-bought dresses and had her hair set at the salon in Huntington twice a month. She leaned close to Margaret, her perfume overwhelming in the cold air. Margaret, dear, I heard about your situation. Stuffing moss in your walls like a pioneer woman. It is quite resourceful, I suppose, but people are talking. It looks desperate, don't you think? Margaret kept her eyes forward. Keeps the cold out. That is all that matters to me. Clara's voice dropped lower, taking on a tone of false sympathy. You know, Thomas was a good man, but he did not leave you in the best position. Perhaps it is time to consider your options. My husband mentioned there might be a position available at the boarding house in town. Cleaning rooms, changing linens, that sort of thing. It would give you a proper income and you could sell that drafty old cabin. Margaret turned to face Clara directly. My husband died doing honest work in your husband's mine. That cabin is my home. I will not abandon it because people think moss is beneath them. Clara's face hardened. I was only trying to help. But if you want to live like a hillbilly while the rest of us move forward, that is your choice. The service began before Margaret could respond. She sat through the hymns and the sermon feeling every judgmental glance that came her way. When Reverend Palmer spoke about charity and Christian kindness, several people shifted uncomfortably in their pews, but no one looked at her directly. 3 weeks passed and the temperature dropped to 15 degrees below freezing. Margaret's cabin stayed warmer than it had in years. The moss had dried and compressed into a perfect seal, blocking every draft. She burned half the firewood she normally would have needed, and for the first time since Thomas died, she slept through the night without waking to shivering cold. One afternoon in mid-December, a black automobile came up the mountain road. Margaret was outside splitting kindling when the car stopped in front of her cabin. A man stepped out wearing a heavy wool coat and a felt hat. He was tall and thin with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that took in everything with one quick glance. Mrs. Hayes, my name is Robert Aldrich. I am an engineer with the State Forestry Commission. May I speak with you for a moment? Margaret set down her axe and wiped her hands on her apron. Of course. Would you like to come inside? Aldrich followed her into the cabin. His eyes moved across the walls, studying the moss-packed seams with intense interest. He pulled off his glove and pressed his hand against one of the sealed gaps, then moved to another section and did the same. Remarkable, he said quietly. Who did this work? I did, Margaret answered. Is something wrong? Aldrich turned to face her with an expression she could not read. Wrong? Mrs. Hayes, this is some of the most effective insulation work I have seen in 20 years of studying mountain construction. We have been researching ways to help families in these hills weatherize their homes for winter. We have tried everything from expensive commercial caulking to tar paper to oakum filling. Nothing works as well as this in these extreme temperatures. He walked to another wall and examined it closely. The moss retains just enough moisture to stay pliable but not enough to rot the wood. It expands and contracts with the logs. It creates an airtight seal while still allowing the cabin to breathe. How did you know to do this? My grandmother taught me when I was a girl. She said moss was nature's gift to mountain people. Aldrich pulled out a small notebook and began writing. Mrs. Hayes, would you be willing to show me exactly how you harvested and applied this moss? The commission is developing a manual to help families across 6 counties prepare for winter. If this method works as well as I think it does, it could help hundreds of people. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, like a frozen river beginning to crack. You want to learn from me? If you are willing to teach me, yes. And there would be compensation, of course. The commission pays consultants $50 for technical expertise. Margaret sat down slowly in her chair by the window. $50. More than half of what the mining company had given her for Thomas's life. If you are hoping this story has a happy ending, take a moment and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will change everything. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks working alongside Robert Aldrich. They traveled to 3 different cabins in the surrounding hills, and she demonstrated her technique to families who were struggling through the brutal winter. She showed them which moss to harvest, how to prepare it, how to pack it tight into the gaps, and how to maintain it through the changing seasons. The families listened with respect. These were people like her, miners' wives and farmers' daughters who understood that survival in the mountains required knowledge that no store-bought solution could replace. Word spread quickly through the hollows and ridges. The widow Hayes knew something valuable, something that actually worked. Aldrich's report to the Forestry Commission was enthusiastic. He wrote 12 pages detailing Margaret's method, complete with diagrams and seasonal recommendations. The commission printed 5,000 copies of a pamphlet titled Natural Insulation Methods for Mountain Dwellings, with Margaret's technique featured prominently on pages 4 through 7. In January, Margaret received a letter on State Forestry Commission letterhead. They wanted to hire her as a field consultant for the winter weatherization program. The job would pay $75 a month and require her to travel across 3 counties teaching families her moss packing method. She would also help develop other traditional techniques that mountain people had used for generations but that were being forgotten as families tried to adopt city ways they could not afford. Margaret accepted immediately. She bought a sturdy pair of boots and a warm coat with her first paycheck. She had a wooden sign made that read M. Hayes, field consultant, and hung it by her door, not out of pride but out of quiet satisfaction. By February, she had taught 43 families her method. Some of the same women who had whispered about her at church now asked her for advice. Clara Pemberton's own mother, who lived in a drafty house at the edge of town, requested a visit. Margaret went without hesitation and spent an afternoon showing the elderly woman how to seal her windows and door frames. The work gave Margaret something she had not felt since Thomas died: purpose. Every family she helped, every child who slept warmer at night because of what she taught their parents, it all meant something. She was not just surviving anymore. She was building something new from the ruins of her old life. One evening in late February, she sat by her fireplace with a cup of tea and looked around her small cabin. The walls she had sealed herself stood solid against the howling wind outside. The fire burned low and steady, needing only a few logs to keep the room comfortable. She thought about that day in Morrison's store when she had felt so small, so helpless, so discarded by a world that had no use for a widow with empty pockets. She had been wrong about being discarded. She just needed to remember what she was worth. Spring arrived in West Virginia with a burst of green that transformed the gray mountains into rolling waves of color. Margaret's contract with the Forestry Commission was extended through the summer to help families prepare for the following winter. Her reputation had grown beyond the 3 counties she initially served. Letters arrived from Kentucky, Tennessee, and even Ohio asking for information about her methods. In April, the State University in Morgantown invited her to speak at a conference on sustainable mountain living. Margaret took the train, her first time traveling alone since Thomas died. She stood before a room of 50 people, professors and government officials and community leaders, and she spoke clearly about what her grandmother had taught her and what the mountains had given her. After her presentation, a woman approached her. She was young, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. "My name is Elizabeth Porter. I teach at the Agriculture Extension Program. We need someone like you to help develop our curriculum on traditional Appalachian practices. Would you consider teaching a course next fall?" Margaret considered the offer carefully. Teaching meant stability, a regular income, respect. It also meant sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of mountain women. Knowledge that deserved to be preserved and honored rather than dismissed as backward or primitive. She accepted the position. In June, Margaret walked into Morrison's general store for the first time in months. Walter Morrison looked up from his counter, and his expression shifted from indifference to something almost like embarrassment. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, clearing his throat, "I heard about your work with the commission. Quite impressive." Margaret placed a small stack of pamphlets on the counter. "The Forestry Commission asked me to distribute these around town. They explain the moss packing technique and other weatherization methods. I thought you might keep some here at the store for customers who need them." Morrison picked up one of the pamphlets and flipped through it slowly. "Your name is all over this thing. I had no idea that day when you bought that moss bundle that it would lead to all this." "Neither did I," Margaret said simply. "But that is how life works sometimes. You cannot see the path ahead until you take the first step." Morrison nodded slowly. "For what it is worth, I was wrong to laugh at you that day. You showed more sense than any of us gave you credit for." Margaret did not need his apology, but she accepted it gracefully anyway. "People do what they know how to do. I just happened to know something different." She left the store and walked down the main street of Beckford. The afternoon sun warmed her face. Children played in front yards. Neighbors called greetings to each other. She was no longer the desperate widow people pitied or the strange woman they whispered about. She was Margaret Hayes, teacher and consultant, a woman who had found her way through the coldest winter of her life and emerged stronger on the other side. 5 years later, Margaret stood in front of her cabin on a crisp October morning. The logs she had sealed with moss that desperate winter still held firm, weathered by 5 seasons but stronger than ever. She was 47 now, her hair showing more silver, but her eyes held a brightness that had been absent for so long after Thomas died. The cabin was no longer her only home. She kept a small apartment near the university in Morgantown during the academic year, where she taught 2 courses on traditional Appalachian practices and sustainable living. Her classes were always full, with students coming from across the state and beyond to learn from her. But she returned to this cabin every chance she got, especially during the summers when she led field workshops in the surrounding mountains. A young woman named Sarah had become her assistant, a miner's daughter from Kentucky who reminded Margaret of herself at that age. Together, they had expanded the natural insulation program to include 17 counties across 3 states. They had documented 43 traditional techniques that mountain families had used for generations, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The Forestry Commission had promoted Margaret to senior consultant. She earned more money now than Thomas ever had in the mines, enough to make repairs on the cabin, to save for the future, to help other widows who found themselves in situations she understood too well. Last month, the University Press published her book, Mountain Wisdom: Traditional Practices for Modern Living. The first printing of 3,000 copies sold out in 6 weeks. She had dedicated it to Thomas and to her grandmother, the 2 people who had shaped her life in different ways. Clara Pemberton had stopped by the cabin 2 weeks ago. Her husband had died of a heart attack the previous winter, and she found herself alone in that big house with its expensive furnishings and store-bought decorations. She asked Margaret how she had survived those early months of widowhood, how she had found the strength to keep going. Margaret had made tea and they sat together by the fireplace. She told Clara the truth. That strength was not something you found, it was something you built, one small decision at a time, one frozen morning at a time, one handful of moss at a time. Now, standing in her doorway watching the autumn leaves drift down from the oak trees, Margaret thought about that terrible November day when she had walked into Morrison's store with $3 in her purse and no idea how she would survive the winter. She thought about the 3 pennies she had placed on the counter, the dignity she had insisted on maintaining even when everyone else thought she was foolish. Those 3 pennies had bought more than a bundle of moss. They had bought her self-respect, her future, and proof that value does not come from what others think you are worth. It comes from what you know you can become.